Well, thanks everybody for being on. This is Members Matters, an opportunity for all of you to talk about the things that you're dealing with in your districts, things that you might want to share or ask questions of with your colleagues to see how they're handling things. You've got myself on here today, and of course, the real experts that can answer questions. Jen Smith can answer all things legislative, and Brad Banasic will be able to answer all things legal. I have a couple of things that I'll touch on. Brad and I ahead of time had a couple of topics that might be of interest to you, but then we'll really want to make sure that we open it up and see if there's some burning things that are keeping you up at night as we go into the end of the school year. I know for some of you, you're probably going into bargaining season. Brad is going to touch a little bit on that. Just a couple of housekeeping things for MASB that I'll share. One, it's becoming that time of the year for our CASBA awards, or I should say our CBA awards that we offer at the CASBA or hand out at the CASBA meetings. So I would encourage you to, if you're active in your CASBA or maybe you're an officer in your CASBA, kind of be aware of that. Make sure that you reach out to MASB and ask about the award so that we get you on the schedule. As I think probably most of you know, Cindy Holmes left us for different employment late in the fall. And so Katie Kosmiter is our new membership coordinator. She started with us in January. Served in the membership space for the Michigan Pharmacists Association before. So she's worked with member groups before, but Katie would be who you want to reach out to and ask questions about the county association and getting things scheduled. I'm actually doing my first one Thursday night. So we already have people moving in that direction. So be aware of that. As I also mentioned, CASBAs, if you're active or an officer, make sure that if you're looking for people to present at your CASBAs, wondering on things that are going on, free of charge, MASB staff, if you need a legal update, a legislative update, state of the association, different, labor, we definitely can get people out to your CASBA to do those presentations as well. So just be aware of that. The other thing I'll mention, if you have a regional seat that was up for election for MASB this year, make sure you cast your ballot as a district. I think you have until the end of the first week of March, somewhere around there, to cast a ballot as a district. So if you've got a meeting in between now and then, make sure that that gets on your agenda. Not every region has one, so but emails would have went out to you to let you know, so you'll know if you have one or not. The other thing that I would point out is in our most recent leaderboard magazine, I don't know if you caught it or not, but we had an advertisement in there. MASB launched its first ever DE&I workshop series to work with boards and administrative teams, not to implement DE&I out to your community, but to actually figure out where you are as a board and as a district if you haven't walked down this road at all. So it's kind of a check of where you're at as a district, and then really facilitate a conversation about what would be next steps to try to make sure you're doing the things that you need to in your district. And then with your community, it's kind of what I would say is a toe in the water to like make sure that you're moving in the right direction. It's a 2 workshop series. You can check it out in that leaderboard magazine, but we really would like to see districts looking at that and reaching out to us if there is interest. I know that DE&I in some districts has become, kind of buzzword controversial. We're trying to make sure that we enter this conversation in a way that gets to where we need to, but also is a space to have an outside third-party facilitator coming in and talking with you about it. Clearly, these meetings are open to the public. so that we can frame it so it's not always the board trying to frame sometimes uncomfortable conversation. And so anyways, I just encourage you to look at that and be aware of it. Larissa threw a link up in the chat about the Building Belonging workshop series. Let's see, Mark, you asked a question. Specific events at the NSBA annual conference other than recognition for president-elect. No other Michigan-specific events. We have folded our reception into hosting the reception for Don Hubler, who will become president of NSBA at the annual conference. Maybe surprising, maybe not, but whenever a person takes the presidency of NSBA, the resident state is the one responsible for funding and putting on that conference. So we are not doing two receptions. That will be it, because it's we are expecting a reception of, we don't invite everybody, but we do invite everybody from Michigan that's attending, plus others. So that's probably 350 people at a reception for Don Hubler, and recognizing him becoming president of NSBA, which is a testament to the respect that Don carries at the national level for his leadership about kids. He's as kid-centered as any school board member that I've ever worked with or know, and we're honored that he's on our board still and that he's moving into that space. But that is the main event for NSBA this year, Mark. Good question. I see Cheryl posted in chat. Deadline for voting for the NSBA board of, or NSBA for MASB's board of directors, March 6th at 1 p.m. So if you have a board meeting between now and then, please do so. I think if we have any issue when the board is pushed for greater involvement and greater number of people running, we made changes to try to make that better in the last 6 years. It really is that voting participation. It's really having the districts actually cast a ballot. Is the one area that we could really still see improvement in that election area. So on the handful of things I mentioned, CASBA awards, meetings, voting, DE&I workshops, any questions on any of those items? I don't see any hands going up. You can always throw them in chat, or you can ask me, you can ask about them later. So I am going to turn, Brad and I were talking about a couple of areas before we came on air, and I'm going to have him talk about both of them. The first one I'll throw at you, Brad, is we are at a space, we hear about it all the time from boards and superintendents about staff shortage, substitutes, bus drivers, wherever it is. And invariably, what we end up hearing about is what can a board member, or what capacity can a board member serve in those places? Can they drive buses? Can they coach teams? Can they teach in classrooms? And I think this issue was out there before there was a shortage. It's more common now. And so I thought it would be good for Brad to touch on this, because we are hearing more. Brad just had a question this week on it. So I thought it would be good for Brad to touch in that area. So Brad, you want to tackle that one first?
Sure, Don, thanks. So the initial legal rule in this case is, a board member cannot be employed by the district where they're serving. That's in violation of Michigan's incompatible public offices law. So then the next question I get, well, if I can't be employed as a substitute teacher or as a bus driver or as a coach, can I do that on a voluntary basis? And there is an exception in the incompatible office law that does allow a board member to volunteer, but it's a limited exception. It only applies to athletic coaches or supervisors of extracurricular activities or functions. So the one example that Don gave as a bus driver, a volunteer bus driver, that volunteer exception would not apply. So even if you have a willing board member that's certified to drive a bus, retired bus driver, and decided to run for the board and wishes to continue as a substitute bus driver as a volunteer, that law, the exception to the incompatible office law, does not cover that position. Only covers coaches and supervisors of extracurricular activities. And at another level, that exception has multiple elements to it as well. So if you are going to be a volunteer coach or a volunteer supervisor, first you have to go through a criminal history, criminal record checks. As a board member, traditionally you don't have to do that. Your staff members have to go through that criminal history, criminal record check, fingerprint check, background check. But board members do not. However, if you're going to be a volunteer coach as a board member, you have to do that. And then you would abstain from any matter that comes before the board involving that extracurricular activity or athletic team. And then probably the most important element, besides you do it on a voluntary basis, not receiving compensation, is that there are no other qualified candidates for that position. And that means the board member is the last kind of resort to filling that position. So it's not that the board member is the most qualified of all the candidates and thus can get the position. That's not how the exception reads. It's there are no other qualified candidates. And that could be members, could include members of the bargaining unit as well as members outside of the bargaining unit that may be applying for that position. So there are some very specific requirements to that issue. So if your board runs into the matter of a board member volunteering, feel free to reach out, and I got an article I can send to you on that as well. And then one other issue related to the facts of a board member either being employed or volunteering for the district is the application process. So let's say the board member doesn't want to be a volunteer, wants to remain on the board while applying for a school district position. That's not covered in the law, whether the board member has to resign prior to applying, but it's likely covered in your board policies if you're a Neola client. Neola has some optional language that you can choose that indicates that if a board member applies for a school district employment position, the board member must resign before applying, and then that resignation has to be accepted by the board as well before the board member applies. So a lot of information there. Any questions on
What
any of
about
that?
if you're working, you go to work for a third-party vendor that services the school, like a third-party bus vendor or third-party cafeteria vendor?
Great question, Ahmed. So there isn't a published opinion on that from the Attorney General, but I actually have a letter from the Attorney General's office that addressed this issue a ways back, where you had a retired teacher wanting to substitute teach in the district while serving on the board. The individual thought it would be permissible because their substitute teachers were employed through a third party. The AG looked at that issue and said, no, we still have incompatible situations that apply. You still have an indirect supervisory situation there. So based on that opinion, I've universally have advised that that should not occur as well. So a board member should not be working through the school district via a third party contract.
There goes my cafeteria work. Okay.
I mean, you made light of it at the end, Ahmed, but it is. I was telling Brad, he had a question this week, and I actually just happened to be visiting family this weekend and heard of a school district that mentioned, like, oh, this school board member, as a last resort, the superintendent will drive bus sometimes, which is legal, but then said, oh, and the board president will sometimes drive a bus. And I was like, yeah, I don't think you should be going down that road,
No.
no matter what the situation is. But I'm not asking for a show of hands, and any of you. Most of you are larger districts. I think it affects smaller districts a little bit more, but it's why I had Brad bring it up, just because it is sometimes where districts feel that they're forced to go, and board members are volunteers by nature and want to help out, but the liability concerns and the other issues that come about in this become too large, even if it's not for pay.
And Don, I got a good follow-up question that was sent directly to me in
Okay.
the chat. And that is, what about board members volunteering kind of informally in school. So it's not to the level of a volunteer where you have to go through a background check or an iChat. It's just maybe going to a family member's, their son and daughters or grandchild's birthday event at school. So you're going to be on school property. So possibly that could fit within the category of a volunteer. I've taken the position that that type of volunteer, situation falls outside of the incompatible offices law. It's more, informal. You're not going through an approval process. And, if that's an issue in a school district, I actually encourage districts to adopt an administrative rule that distinguishes between volunteers and visitors. And then that draws a line. So, if you're a board member and you fit into that visitor category, and one of the descriptions of being a visitor is, going to a school event where you're not directly supervising children, you're not, chaperoning, other staff members are there as part of that event. So you're in the visitor category, but a volunteer would be, volunteering as an assistant coach or volunteering in the drama program that may fit within a Schedule B position in a collective bargaining agreement. So if it's a very informal type of situation where you're going into a classroom just to read to kids, most cases that's going to fit as a visitor rather than a volunteer, and then there wouldn't be an incompatible situation there.
Brad, what if you have a situation where you volunteer for Career Week and you're letting a student shadow you for the week? And is that considered a problem?
In that case, I would say most likely not. There's no guidance or precedent on that issue, Ahmed. I guess I would focus on what type of approval process, background process you go through in order to be part of Career Week. Now, clearly, that's not a traditional paid position, right?
No.
No, and the other volunteer positions we talked about, bus driver, coach, substitute teacher, if board members are willing to volunteer in positions, those are traditional paid positions. So in that case, because it's not a traditionally paid position, I don't think it would be in conflict with the incompatible office law, but possibly your local policies would address that and may exclude a board member from doing that, but it would be a local decision.
Thank you.
Yep.
The one thing on that question, Brad, that I think about, not legally as you would be approaching it, anytime that there is, well, let's call it an application process, right? That somebody in the district has to approve a school board member to do this. So it's not coming in like the teacher like is having you like volunteer for, you're doing a band competition today and they need a chaperone to go to a neighboring district from the competition. Like the teacher approved, but like in general, like if it's something bigger where an employee is having to approve whether a board member is going to, like, that's when it's not a legal issue, but that becomes that place of like, am I forcing that individual employee, particularly if it's a superintendent, to make a decision to take me along or to say yes to me, where in other cases they might not? And would it displace other parents if you took that spot? And are they going to complain about it? So I think to me, it's one of those things there. You just ask yourself the question, like, and it's not a legal answer like Brad is giving. It's really like, where does this stack up? Do they need people in this area? Am I supplanting somebody that is now not going to have an opportunity? Did I put the employee in an awkward position because they have to make a choice? I often, even in my role here at MASB, and I think about my kids as they've went through school, I do think there are times as a board member or a superintendent even where you do sacrifice a little bit, and sadly, I would say a little bit of your parenting role because of like you want to not be perceived in one way or another. And I think it's too bad that we're in that space, but we know that happens. Like you make decisions and you're like, yeah, I don't want to take that on because I don't want to make my kid uncomfortable, And so I would just say, watch it closely and make the right choices. I think board members, almost always do. Like I can, every once in a while we'll hear like board members pushing really hard to be a coach or something like that. But I think board members make good decisions and they're always self-sacrificing. But I just, look at it through the lens of somebody else and see what they would think, and or maybe look through the lens of the person that you think doesn't like you and see what they would think, and that might give you an indication whether you should do it or not.
Well, it's the old story. What would Brad do?
No.
That's for sure.
Well, I actually, what Don said, I think really makes a lot of sense. And, another direct question came to me was, what about chaperoning a middle school dance? And I think what you indicated, Don, that kind of fits squarely, in that situation. Am I supplanting another parent's opportunity to do this? And could my, influence as a board member give me, a greater advantage to get that chaperoning position? So a lot of factors come into play, but again, in that situation, there's not really a legal issue. I think you could address it through policy or operating procedures or administrative rules, but yeah, you wouldn't be violating the law by serving on the board and chaperoning a middle school dance, but you could be doing that contrary to board policy.
Another question and you guys can feel free to, as you've been doing on follow-up here, any question that you have for Brad or Jen, throw it in the chat and they can jump on and answer it. The other topic that we were talking about, Brad and I were talking about.
Before you get into that, Don, looks like Nick raised his hand.
Oh, I'm sorry, Nick.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring Jen into the conversation. Has there been any update on Senate Bill 463, the FAFSA requirement? What's the latest on that?
It is currently sitting in the House Education Committee. The mess that the federal government has found itself in with the FAFSA is working in our favor on that bill. The latest I heard is that some people are not going to get their information for another month or two, which is way past application to college and acceptance to college. So this rollout has been an absolute disaster for the federal government and for families who are depending on that information, unfortunately, but it does slow this bill down. I would still suggest talking to your reps if you can. We've heard that the chair of the House committee is not a fan of the mandate, but might want to do something. But I don't know at this point, as long as the FAFSA stays in the news, I think it's hard for them to say, yes, and let's make it a graduation requirement that you can't get filled out or get information back from. So it at least slowed it down. I think there's still going to be a push for people to fill out the FAFSA, but we see additional money in the budget for FAFSA incentives to go out to schools and additional money for the Michigan Achievement Scholarship, which requires you to fill out the FAFSA. And data on that has been really strong, that a lot of people have been filling it out. A lot of money is out the door. And I think just based on other states and their success, that's where the success comes from, is if there's a reason, if there's a clear end goal, not just fill this out and see what happens, but fill this out to qualify for the scholarship. So hopefully we'll see our numbers go up with the things that we have, and some of this push will die down. But right now, the biggest thing on our side is this absolute mess that the rollout of the new FAFSA has created.
Well, hopefully, I reached out to Camilleri's office, and clearly I'm not on the east side of the state. So they gave me the standard pat answer, but my representation is fully on board with, keeping the schools out of having to manage this kind of program. It's just another one of those big things. But okay, I was just curious if I'm glad to hear it's stuck in the mud, I guess.
Yes.
Well, I see, Kurt, you just asked a question of Brad related to labor. And so the next question I was going to ask of Brad was a labor question. So he can take on labor in a broad space. But the one I was going to pose to him, and I found it interesting because it's a little bit different than what we're used to. So often when we see a law passed in Michigan that affects labor contracts, what we'll see is language in them that say nothing that in this law impairs a current contract, and it doesn't need to be implemented until that contract has expired. That's been pretty typical language that we've seen for a long time. We had a lot of labor changes last year regarding prohibited subjects of bargaining. And so I wanted Brad to kind of explain how those law changes will impact you, particularly if your contract with your teachers or other units isn't up this summer in the effective year of the act. So Brad, if you want to take that one on and then follow up with whatever labor questions that you get, because I'm sure there'll be more.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Don. So last week, February 13th, was the unprohibited subject day, where what used to be prohibited subject of bargaining became essentially mandatory subjects of bargaining under the Public Employment Relations Act. Now, if you have a contract that is going to be expiring June 30th, or maybe already expired December 31st, clearly you're going to be required to bargain these issues with your union when they make a demand to bargain. Now, the issue that Don brought up is, well, let's say you entered into a multi-year agreement last year and your contract doesn't expire until 2025. And you're like thinking, well, if the union makes a demand to bargain these new mandatory subjects, we can simply ignore that demand because we have a settled contract. Well, the issue with taking that position is that under established law, as under the Public Employment Relations Act, as interpreted by the Michigan Employment Relations Commission, you can only unilaterally act on a mandatory subject of bargaining when it's covered in the contract, or there's an express waiver in the contract, or you've taken negotiations to impact. If you meet one of those three kind of exceptions, yeah, you can take unilateral action on a mandatory subject of bargaining without bargaining that matter. So most of your boards have policies on these new mandatory subjects of bargaining, whether it's teacher placement, layoff and recall, issues relating to evaluations, discipline. So those policies essentially result in the district taking unilateral action on these mandatory subjects of bargaining as of last week, February 13th. And clearly your contracts have not covered these issues because they were prohibited subjects up until last week. There can't be any express waiver provision in your contract unless whoever was negotiating your contract in 2011 had the forethought to think, well, these might come back into play at some point, so I'm going to put a waiver in here saying, if any of these issues become mandatory subjects of bargaining, the union waives the right to bargain these until the contract expires. You may have that language in your contract, but I'm going to bet it's not in there. So then the last one is, are you at impasse? No, clearly no one's at impasse right now. So because the union has never had the opportunity to bargain these new mandatory subjects of bargaining, if they make a demand to bargain on these matters, even with a settled contract, most law firms have taken the position that you have to bargain with them. Now, you don't have to say yes to their bargaining proposals. You just need to sit down, and your negotiating team or your administrative team has to sit down and bargain these new mandatory subjects. Now, whether you progress to any type of resolution, then that would be settled via a letter of agreement. You're not opening up the contract because of these new mandatory subjects. You would be agreeing to a letter of agreement outside of the mandatory subjects, and then that would have the force of the contract if that's agreed to. So, yeah, kind of a complicated issue. I would be curious, those who are participating today, you can either put it in the chat box or raise your hand. Has anyone received a demand to bargain these new mandatory subjects of bargaining as of last Tuesday, whether it be with an expiring contract or a settled contract?
Not yet.
Okay.
Oh, nope. Somebody just said we have.
Now, Sarah, did you have a settled contract, or is your contract expiring? Expiring. Okay.
Yeah. And I think that probably, Brad, that's
Mm-hmm.
probably going to be pretty typical. If you're expiring this year, like you can expect the union's going to like have all of these up for conversation. And
Sure.
I had just shared with Dan and Brad last week. There was a article I read in the MEA newsletter about Clausen's just settled a contract, and they talked about all the different pieces, where what positions they took on the different past prohibited subjects of bargaining. So we could expect a lot of that to happen in the upcoming next 6 months here.
And I guess in response to Kirk's post in the chat box, board members have varying levels of involvement in negotiations. For the most part, board members do not serve on negotiating teams, but in some cases they do. I actually presented on the issue of the board's role in negotiations, and we had a little bit of discussion on the pros and cons of board members serving on a negotiating team. And MASB hasn't adopted a rule saying, one way or the other. We say it's a local decision, how involved, board members are going to be. But for the most part, that it starts out at the board level, Kurt, with, the board setting parameters for the upcoming negotiation. So that's really where your board involvement starts. And then also relying on what your current policy indicates as far as what's been delegated to the administration in terms of creating a negotiating team and or bringing suggested parameters back to the board for approval, and possibly meeting in closed session with your negotiating team to set those parameters and adjust those parameters on an as needed basis. And then I think this negotiation season is going to be more important than ever, for the board to be unified in supporting the negotiation team. It's likely going to be longer than negotiations, longer negotiations than you experienced as a school board the last 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So try to limit the possible cracks in the support at the board level for your negotiating team, and a lot of that comes down to communication. Really would encourage administrators to keep the board constantly in touch with what's going on in communications and letting them know, what are the big issues at the bargaining table. Obviously, we think teacher placement is going to be a big issue, but who knows? In some districts, it may not be. Maybe the teachers are focusing on discipline more than teacher placement. But just giving the board an idea of what they're finding out in these negotiations, because it's kind of a new world. We haven't been here in a while.
Brad, I got a question for you. Have you had many boards that have included a board member on their negotiating team?
When I did my presentation at the workshop, and I asked that question, and I probably had about 40 or so people in my breakout session, and 4 or 5 board members raised their hand, said they had served on negotiating teams, and most part, I think those districts were smaller. I even heard, and Don, you may be familiar with this, that in some UP districts, it's actually a committee of the board that negotiates the contract, which is really unique. But if it's worked for a district in the past, why change? And depending upon the size of the district, I guess if it's worked for them, I wouldn't suggest doing something different.
Got it. Thank you.
Actually, I had not heard of that, like a committee of the board, Brad. That's interesting. I think it's really, I think Brad's right. It's what either has worked in the past, and I've talked to superintendents and board members where, for different reasons, there's an existing relationship. Maybe that board president has a close relationship with the union president or something, and they think there would be some advantage there. Where, of course, the traps lay in that, right, is you need to have the rest of the board feeling very comfortable about that role, because immediately we've created a balance of power issue with whoever it is on the board. They now have more information. And so I think it really has a lot to do with, will it help your district? How does the whole board feel about it? As Brad said, in his, kind of presentation, we can say, 10%, or, we're in that room saying they probably have 10% overall. Probably seems a little high based on what I've heard over the years. So I just, if it makes a lot of sense, I think it's something to be explored. You probably want all of the board members, and particularly your superintendent, to feel comfortable that is in fact would be the case, because I think, as Brad pointed out, this year will be very different for board members that haven't been on the board since before 2010. And what we find, if you have contentious negotiations, and you may not, like, these may be easier things for districts to settle, is that the unions will often target board members, right? They see them as the weak link, right? Where you're elected, so we're going to pull on those levers. It's an election year for board members this year, so that plays into it even a little bit more. So I just think you just have to be cautious as you look at it in a year like this with everything new on the table. I've even talked to districts that have new superintendents, even if in the last couple of years. Let's say you've promoted a principal or a curriculum director. They've never sat at the table themselves. Right. And that's a new world for them. And if you would like them to get started off in a relationship with the teachers that's a little bit different than adversarial, it's hard not to be somewhat adversarial at a bargaining table. That's a place where, I'm not saying that's a place where board members step in and negotiate. That's a place where you might give the green light to your superintendent to bring in a third party to help with negotiations, just because they're doing it for a lot of districts and they have a little more experience on it. I know some boards feel uncomfortable, like, I just hired this person and they should know how to do it. Well, if they've never done it, there's no reason for them to know it. And you want to put them in the best position to be successful, both in bargaining and in being a superintendent. So I think even that's something to really look at and say, well, I know it's a little bit of money, but do we want to look at a third party of some kind to help out? Superintendent might still be a part of it, but the heavy lifting maybe gets done by somebody else. Just because it's just going to be a different year for negotiation. And the one thing that isn't a prohibited subject that I think will have a big impact on districts this year is, up until now, really since we made the change in 2010, if your contract expired on, say, June 30th, and we're going to start the school year and your contract is not settled, under the old laws, teachers didn't get step increases. The cost of insurance was pushed. The increased cost of insurance was borne by the employees. That was put in place to really incentivize settling a contract and not letting it run into the school year unsettled. That law was struck down. They undid that law in the legislature this year. So now when your contract expires, if you're still negotiating in September, step increases will happen. Any increases in insurance will something that you have to have a conversation on. Often the district pays that increase until the contract is settled. So we got rid of that incentive to settle before the school year started. And I think that's going to have as big of an impact on contract conversations this summer as any of the prohibited subjects will have, because, that language also affects, if you're having a hard time with, what your increase for the year is going to be, or other things along those lines beyond the prohibited subjects. I will be shocked if we don't see contract negotiations for some districts run into the school year this year. And we had largely done away with that after that change in 2010. So that's going to be, I think, a big impact on districts this year.
Yeah, I agree, Don.
Brad, how many of your districts use their attorney as the lead negotiator?
Oh, I would say a great majority. It's hard to put a number on it, Ahmed, but yeah, I think certainly this year you'll see that kind of reach its peak. How many districts are bringing in a third party to do their negotiations?
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And to that question, Ahmed, you said lead their attorney. Sometimes it's not the attorney. They could reach out to, like MASB does contract negotiations. So it's a third party that a majority use. It's not necessarily their retainer firm. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but the point Don made about what we referred to as Public Act 54 being repealed, yeah, it may lead to more impasse this year. Again, another presentation I presented last week at our labor conference and or 2 weeks ago, and some who knows what the unions are going to want going into these negotiations, and may make settling the contract contingent upon that one issue that is a point of emphasis in their negotiations. And if the district's unwilling to budge on that issue, you might get to impasse, and then the issue of implementing a calendar or implementing other mandatory subjects of bargaining come into play. So we haven't seen impasse within the last 10 years or so, but it's possible it could make a comeback this year.
Nick, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, as always, it was an excellent labor conference. It was also a little bit unfair. It was 62 degrees, and the conference was held next to the Acres golf courses at Michigan State, which kind of made me a little sad leaving. But two takeaways. The first, sitting at a table with all superintendents from smaller districts, just know that he or she will have a lot on their plate. And, I wouldn't say they were overwhelmed, but many of them were newer superintendents and had never been in the previous environment where these things were negotiated. So you could kind of see a lot of extra speed on the note taking and lots of good questions at the table from each other. So if you're in a district that's smaller, I think you're going to need a little bit extra grace and maybe some extra loving on the side, because those districts will have a lot of extra work for their superintendents that are wearing multiple hats. My statement, or more of the surprise takeaway for me, was really on the evaluation side, and this concept of school learning objectives versus using the M-STEP as the growth factor. So for those that weren't there, obviously there's a lot of changes in that area, and I don't know, Brad, if you're going to write an article or whatever, but I think that would be an interesting one, where I don't know that a lot of school board members understand the difference between school learning objectives, which your district might put together, that aren't based on any sort of national standard for evaluations, and then using that in evaluating a teacher. And, if you're having issues with the teacher and you've just got your homegrown school learning objectives, how hard that would be to defend. And so what will you use? Will it be the NWEA? Will it be what learning objectives or growth factors, or, all of that was probably my biggest. I left with, I really don't know what to do, other than I don't think I like school learning objectives. But it would be curious, if you have some time, maybe that would be a nice little one pager to sort of give people a heads up on, because that was the biggest takeaway for me, or at least the biggest area of not the biggest area of ignorance for me.
Yeah, I actually have some FAQs teed up, and hopefully they will be ready to go within the next couple of weeks. And tied to that, we could address the issue of the student learning objectives. But yeah, I think a lot of individuals are taken aback that state assessments are no longer a required element of evaluations. And I guess, Nick, that's where we're negotiating. A lot of those evaluation elements are really going to come into play, is and that might be an area where you reach impasse on agreeing to those elements of the evaluation.
Yeah, Jen, did her very best in trying to push back on many of the changes that were made in the legislative arena this year or last year, I guess. And as much as MASB was supportive of changes in evaluation law, we wanted to see a lower percentage. And even the idea that a school district could make a choice, and at that time, of course, it was still your choice, not a bargaining issue, but like the idea that you could pick NWEA or some other, we'll call it a standardized test that is used widely, that as a district you would make that choice and say we don't like using the M-step because of how, maybe it's the content or when it's given or whatever it is. Like we always are advocating for options for districts to be able to make those decisions. So the fact that we went away from a requirement to use the M-step, it wasn't overly alarming to us. But I do think when you get to that SLO conversation that you bring up, Nick, it's such a different conversation, right? It's not an easy, what number did your kids that you're teaching get? It's there's some positives to it, right? Like I think about the work environment. You adopt goals with an employee, and these are the objectives that you're going to meet in these goals, and you get evaluated on them. If you do really good SLOs at the individual level, that might work. But the time to get to that point, to sit down as a principal and reach learning objectives with every one of your teachers, that, I think it's a great way to go, but it is also so time consuming with the amount of staff, and like the evaluations themselves are hard to do. Now let's do all, like, I just think it's a lot, as you just said, right? We and board members, you don't even know enough about what that looks like at the district level and the individual level to decide, like, how easy is that to even get to in an evaluation? Like, is that something that a principal can easily judge, or is it something that's going to be really difficult, that's going to make it even harder to get all the evaluations done that a principal has to get done? So,
well, I think with the MASB having the pulse of what's happening with CASBAs and ISDs and some of the larger districts or broadly across Michigan, be curious to see what people are doing. Sounds like a good breakout at the annual conference, or maybe even a speaker on it. But obviously we're fortunate in our district, but I don't know of too many districts that are able to just sort of set aside and go write a whole bunch of student learning objectives for each grade or each secondary, all of the various subjects. I just can't imagine too many districts doing it on their own, but I could possibly see, like in Oakland County or Kent County, maybe put something together and do something. But again, those make me nervous if they're not attached to a national standard. Again, I'm not a standardized test type of person, but I've been in a few employment back and forth, and standards are there for a reason. And if you don't have a strong standard, you might not win your let's just say your teacher discipline scenario, right? So anyway, thanks.
Yep. I know we got about 8 minutes left to 1 o'clock. I know, Nick, you had already asked a question of Jen. Jen, do you have anything that you want to share that's going on legislatively? Or does anybody out there have questions specific to Jen?
There's nothing going on legislatively. The budget's out. We're working on that. All of our updates are available in dashboard and on our website. But there's really not much going on. It's quiet because it's 54-54 in the House.
Jen, what's going to happen with the Department of Education?
Well, constitutionally, it has to exist. So it will continue to exist. MyLeap is pulling a lot of the pre-K out, the university, the community colleges out. But I don't know that the dust has settled on that yet.
Thank you.
And just it's a good question, Ahmed, to talk about. I mean, depends how much people are paying attention that we do have a new department in state government called MyLeap. We actually had Michelle Richard speak to the MASB board of directors at their January meeting to give our board a kind of a look at what does that mean? What does it look like for a membership perspective? I've actually just got word, I've got her scheduled, Michelle scheduled on my podcast in March, where we'll be able to, I'm going to ask her some of those kind of questions about what does this look like? How do our districts, deal with it? The one thing I will say from a district perspective for your staff, because of the way the department, if there was, as Jen mentioned, early childhood was being done at, like GSRP would be a good example, done in the Department of Ed, whereas like daycare licensing was done in another department. Both of those are now in MyLeap, including those staff members. And so if your district was, only because I'm looking at Ken next to you, like, so if Ken Hall was in the Department of Education was serving your district for GSRP, your district will still call Ken Hall to get those questions answered. He's just now sitting in MyLeap instead of MDE. So from an actual service perspective, districts shouldn't see a big disconnect on how that happens. But definitely, we know that in the background, right, there's some push-pull on, who's in charge and the governor and the state superintendent. But at least at this point, from a district perspective, and even talking to some of my, our colleagues in other associations, we haven't at least heard of like a fall down or a fall through the cracks because somebody's not getting serviced. So far, the transition has worked pretty well, but I think Jen's right. It's probably not all done. There's probably other things that will come of this, but you'll have an opportunity if you do the podcast. You'll hear from the director of MyLeap in March, and I'll be speaking with her on that, just to try to share information with our members.
Thank you.
Mark mentioned the newspaper article today about 75% of the MDE budget going to MyLeap. I don't know if that's 100% accurate. We have a meeting with the state budget office this week to ask a whole bunch of questions. And I think we'll have a clearer picture as to how much has actually shifted after that meeting. It is a big number just because of what they're moving around. But they're moving, as Don said, other things too. So I don't know that 75% is accurate, but it's definitely a decent amount.
Yeah, I mean, it depends how you slice that, right, Jen? Like, there's tons of federal money that come into like at-risk money, Title I, like that all goes to the Department of Ed. If you take all the federal money out and we're only looking at what the state puts into the Department of Ed, and we know then that a big percentage of that is in fact early childhood, like you might get to a higher percentage by on how you're slicing state dollars or something along those lines. But to get to 75% of all the dollars that flow through the Department of Ed, I don't know how you would get there based on everything that they cover, right? Food service, like that food service isn't going to MyLeap, at risk and Title I didn't go but if it's only state money, maybe they get to that number. John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, there was a bill that came out. I want to say it was 2 weeks ago. I'm not recalling the number offhand, but it's with regard to homeschooled students being allowed to participate in extracurriculars and athletics. And I kind of wondered really where that's going. I mean, we've had policies in place forever and followed MHSAA and policies. And now it seems like the legislature is trying to change some of that.
I can address it from a legal standpoint, then maybe Jen can address the legislative part of it. But there's actually a court case providing precedent to school districts saying that homeschool students do not have a right under our free public education requirement in the Constitution to participate. So, John, I would qualify that bill as a Tim Tebow bill because the story is Tim Tebow was a homeschool student. He could participate in football down in Florida, and you know the story, won the Heisman National Championship, and all because, his school allowed him to participate as a homeschooler. So some members of the legislature believe that, maybe that's what we should allow in Michigan. So that's my take on it from a legal standpoint. Currently not required by law. You can have a policy that prohibits it, but obviously if that bill is adopted, then that would overrule your local policy.
Jen, anything to add?
I would not expect that bill to go anywhere, judging by its sponsors and the fact that it would make districts accept that. So I don't think you have to worry about that at this point. I also don't know that we have a lot of Tim Tebows around here, and I'd rather have somebody that lasts in the NFL longer.
Okay, we are at 12:58. I appreciate all of you being on today. I appreciate the work that you're doing out in the districts. If there's anything that MASB can do to help you in your roles, superintendents, board members, either one, we're happy to do so. You know how to reach Brad, Jen, I, or any of our staff members. You can get on our website and send us an email, reach out if you have our numbers. We enjoy working with all of you, and we just want to try to make your lives easier. So hopefully today's conversation was helpful and you got some questions answered. Maybe some that you didn't even have going into today, you got answered. But thanks much. We'll see you on this in a couple months. And make sure if you do, as you're going into this season of negotiations, if stuff comes up, reach out to Brad or Dan Feinberg in our labor and legal offices and try to get those questions answered so you're not operating blind in that space. It's an important year on negotiations. So thank you all. Have a good afternoon.